Hello everyone, today we briefly introduce the Republic of Ragusa, a maritime republic based on the city, in fact, of Ragusa. Today Dubrovnik. Ragusa is the name in Italian, German and Latin. Ragusa in Venetian, as a matter of fact. Dubrovnik naturally being the Slavic name. As you know, the city is located in southern Dalmatia, so in today's southernmost Croatia, and the title of Republic of Ragusa, so in Dalmatian Repubblica di Ragusa, in Latin Res Publica Ragusina, in Italian Repubblica di Ragusa, in Croatian Dubrovačka Republika, and in Venetian Repubblica di Ragusa, carried this name, right, properly this, as we'll see now, institutional title of Republic, only from 1358 onwards until essentially the beginning of the 19th century, where it was annexed to the Napoleonic Kingdom of Italy, and then, things changed together with many others. Just think about the secularization in Europe and all that stuff. We will not talk about that. We will talk just about the medieval history of Ragusa that in fact precedes, also as a polity, as a maritime republic, commune, as you want to call it, the mid 14th century, and that in fact has important roots, right, dating to ancient times, because as you know, the Dalmatian coastline was substantially, urbanized, active commercially. These lands formerly remained within the Roman Empire. They had an interesting history because they passed to, for example, the Ostrogoth kingdom at some point, and then they were reoccupied by the Byzantines. Narses invaded Italy for the second time from these areas. So we will surely come across Ragusa in other videos about that period. Today we focus, however, just on the city, as we do with these historical region series, where we pick single communes, republic, and so on, and we tell just the history of theirs, because that's really how they felt about themselves, and especially in this case, as the maritime ones were existing in the first place very often because they were a bit severed from the earthland in the first place. Like in Ragusa, you have the Dinaric Alps. In the rear, you have essentially across the mountains, just the Balkans, a completely different, say, world, right, environment. As we'll see now, these were substantially Slavicized, if not Slavic, areas with substantial Romance influence as well. But there was also Byzantine influence, etc., that we will observe now, right? This republic counted at some point, multiple tens of thousands of inhabitants, several thousands, or perhaps a bit less, some thousands, living within the city walls, right? And it was quite importantly defended. Also thanks to the geographic position that helped a lot, contributing to maintain the spirit of independence, of autonomy. In fact, the Ragusan motto was "Non bene pro toto libertas venditur auro," which in Latin means liberty is not sold for all the gold in the world, right? Which is what definitely embodies liberty. You see the beauty of it. Not freedom, but liberty. It's the most precious good in the world. So we have seen the nomenclature varying over time. Originally, the Ragusan Republic was known as Communitas Ragusina, right? So the idea of a commune, fundamentally. Only in the 14th century, we've seen it would be called Res Publica Ragusina, a title which I think is first mentioned like in 1385, just in the documents at least that we can reconstruct. Still, what's the difference institutionally? Well, not so much. There were naturally some changes over time, but between a commune and a republic, sometimes they call each other in the same way in common language. This is true. We've seen it for multiple Italian communes, for example. But the substance is fundamentally the same. There is an oligarchy that rules in the city that controls a substantial amount of trade, of guilds, of production, right? So they're mostly about that. They're mercantile republics in many ways. There was, as we will see now, a phase of Venetian domination, which brought the Serenissima, rather than the Ragusan own government, to appoint some a rector, essentially, in the city as a ruler. The Slavic name Dubrovnik derives from the word Dubrava, which would be essentially an oak grove, according to a folk etymology, fundamentally. And the first time Dubrovnik is properly named, first recorded in a document for the Adriatic city, because naturally it was used elsewhere in the Slavic hinterland, is in fact in the charter of Ban Kulin in 1189. This charter was essentially a trade agreement between the Banate of Bosnia, so the power of the hinterland in the north of Ragusa, and in fact the Republic, that effectively regulated the Ragusan trade rights in Bosnia, because as we will see here, the leitmotif is the fact that, as far as especially the whoever was involved, right, like the Hungarians, the Byzantines, the Ottomans, etc., and also other powers that wanted, even from the same Italy, to bypass Venetian trade, important to grant trade rights to the Ragusan merchants in their own lands, right? And the main trade was naturally the one, as far as at least as the Republic was more stably connected with, the one between the Mediterranean and the Balkan hinterland, right? Especially with Bosnia, Serbia, etc. Because there were lots of, there were powerful aristocracy in the Balkan hinterland that could export like raw materials, like cattle, timber, whatever. This could be gotten from other places, but mostly getting their kind of more refined products from Ragusa, that in part produced them, or that imported them from elsewhere. Right, so it was very important, especially for the most adjacent powers in the Balkan hinterland, to secure the trade rights of the Ragusan merchants in their own land, right, to incentivize them to come there to make business. So Dubrovnik as a name simply came along, the one of Ragusa, as early as the 14th century. We'll see what the ethnic background of Ragusa really was about. But that vernacular takes a bit more time, at least, to become a literary language, an official one from the chanceries, informal international language, and so on. As far as the Latin, Italian, and Dalmatian name of Ragusa is concerned, this probably comes from Lausa, that is to say, from the Greek, right? From Xau, which means precipice. Perhaps because of this idea of the hinterland mountains just over the sea that are somehow typical of the Dalmatian coastline. And it was later altered from the Greek to Rausium, Ragusium, spelled either with the RH or without H, or Rausia, even Lavusa, Rauja, and Rakusa, GH. In the last case, and finally Ragusa, right? There is another theory that is connected with Proto-Albanian, for which Ragusa, that means berry, could have to do with the origin of the city, but I think it's at least debated. In any case, the city would call itself Dubrovnik only after World War I. So up to that point, it was internationally known, naturally, with the name of Ragusa, right? And historiographically, so we keep calling it like that, international. So looking at the hinterland, that of course determined a great deal of the settlement development. You look at, again, the area of southern Dalmatia, and as far as the Ragusan territorial domination is concerned, which was complex, including isles and etc. all around, this was substantially fixed by 1426, right? So essentially, Ragusa controlled the Dalmatian coast from Neum to Prevlaka, the latter being peninsula, as well as the Peleshats Peninsula and the islands of Lastovo, Milet, as well as a number of smaller islands such as Kolochep, Lopud, and Shipa. And we'll see these names recur. There is a map here inserted towards the beginning. You can easily understand like the naval, the coastal control that the bigger center had on these series of islands, peninsulas, and so on. In the 15th century, there was also the acquisition by the Republic, aside from this coastline, we can say, of the island of Korčula, Brač, and Hvar for about 8 years. Right. However, the control on them was so short-lived because essentially the Ragusans didn't have enough manpower to compete with Venice as far as the aristocratic allegiance of these territories was concerned, right? And when Venice saw that Ragusa had some kind of, popularity in the area, she would just grant some privileges to the aristocrats of these other lands to tie them more to the bigger Venice that was legitimately a superpower. And so this antagonism, albeit as we will see resisting, was mostly a matter of countering the bigger Venice, mostly from the Ottoman side, from whoever or other powers naturally that were interested in kind of decreasing Venetian power, but especially at sea with no success practically. In the 16th century, the administrative units of the Ragusan Republic were Ragusa, the city, Dubrovnik herself. Then there would be some counties, Konavle, Župa, Dubrovačka, Brenos, Lano, the Ragusan littoral, Ston, the island of Lastovo, the island of Milet, the one of Šipan. We have seen this one, Lopud, Kolochep. There would be some captaincies with essentially more of a military colonial character for Tzavtat, Orebic, and Janina. And there you would have rather local magistrates appointed by the major council in order to kind of preserve even the autonomies of these centers. Lastovo and Milet were even more autonomous as far as they were provided with a statute on their own, each one of them. And looking at the origin of the city, there are different ideas. Essentially, the closest known center for which we think that the same inhabitants may have built the same Ragusa was the ancient city of Epidaurum, that corresponds, however, to the modern Tzavtat, right? And the De Administrando Imperio, so an encyclopedical work by the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus for his son and heir Romanus, states that the foundation of Ragusa had been carried out by the inhabitants of the former Epidaurus that had been destroyed by the Avars and the Slavs jointly around 650 AD. Right. This first information is interesting for a number of reasons. From one side, it describes well enough what was happening in this relatively decentralized areas of the Byzantine Empire in a moment of actual exhaustion of the same, while the empire was in fact fighting against the Persians in the east, and the Longobards had been invading Italy, and the Avars, together with the Slavs, were essentially joining forces to harass all the Balkan possessions of the Byzantines, right? And the destruction in itself is also interesting because it talks about a kind of an early stage, right? The most violent one of the Avar, let's say, and Slavic migrations that were seeing these avamposts as essentially some rich praise, right? That they didn't count on just occupying, but just looting, right, and destroying, right, to carry out a sort of scorched earth strategy in the same enemy land, right? Gradually, as we will see, it would be the same Slavs who started settling there on the not just on the remnants of the place, because Subtat would keep growing, would remain the center of a community. And the other interesting thing is the fact that Ragusa and Subtat are something like 25 kilometers in distance. Some survivors of this barbarian attack left Epidaurus and moved 25 kilometers north to a small island near the coast, when they founded the new settlement of Laus. Right. So what happened with these previous this previous center and others around, because we're not overwhelmingly documented about all the various settlements that already existed here, in fact, were resettled by the Slavs during the 7th century. The destructiveness of these migrations resulted, according to some, in the total destruction of the previous center of Epidaurus, so that Subtat would have been sort of built from scratch. This attack would have occurred in 656. In any case, the area was gradually settled by the Slavs that, as we've seen, were much less politically cohesive than, say, the Avars. They had mostly been under these other steppe peoples' dominations during their movements, and only, partly kind of creating some powers of provincial scale. Here we're looking at smaller settlements, evidently. And the Slavs settling in the area would have been the ones giving initially, though we don't really know, the name of Dubrovnik to the site of Ragusa. Right. So, as we'll see, there is also another theory regarding the foundation of the city that basically states that this already existed, right? It was a settlement, at least, already from a very long time, possibly as far as the ancient ones. In any case, the relation between the Slavs and the local, say, the autochthonous inhabitants is also fascinating, because first of all, this area of the Balkans was settled mostly by Romance people, right? Not by Greeks, even though historically you understand Epidaurus as being kind of a Greek name. That some of the most important centers there had been Hellenic colonies back in the day with an Illyrian background. But during the Roman Empire, this area, as far as also an important part of the Balkans, had been rather Romanized than having received a prevalent Greek influence. Right, the Greeks remained always very self-contained, right, within their own coastal areas, and the say Romance language was spoken all across along the Danube, right up to can argue almost the Black Sea. The Slavs had naturally an antagonistic relationship with the Romans because even though we're not so greatly documented, we can easily imagine that also from Italy, as it had historically been the case, there had always been some kind of intense exchanges, right? This world of, at least of cities, of literate communities, of naval powers, were very different, very distant from the Slavic kind of hinterland, continental, tribal origins. Right, the coastland of Dalmatia would naturally see the development of a Slavic piracy of some sort, but again, not much of a true Slavic solid power. Not even they were at best pirates' nests that could be more or less powerful. We'll treat some of them. There are also somehow famous. Think about Pagania, etc. That were in fact just next door to Ragusa at a point, but proving that they couldn't quite storm even some of the largest center, right? That remained mostly an appanage of civilization, in a sense. Here you have, in the area of the Dubrovnik, definitely a strong and quite likely majoritary element with a Romano-Byzantine one at the same time, forming a synthesis of it. You can argue that by the 12th century, the creation of this Ragusian community was already quite strong, identitally speaking, politically, etc. This had just produced itself because of the common interests, the location, the control on the local assets, and also needs of self-defense, right? Because the Slavs, naturally, in the moment which they settled, they had to defend, like the ones that had been before them there. So there was just an important civilizational continuity of some sort. We know that the stradun, which means that the large street in the city center of Dubrovnik, was, we know it archaeologically, the channel dividing Ragusa, right? The Slavs would have lived from one side and the Latins from the other. And ultimately, this street would become the heart of the city herself, so symbolizing that syncresis. In any case, the majority of the people, as we were saying, were Slavic, so Dubrovnik became the name of the united town, and Ragusa was a bit more the representative one. Also because of the rising Italian dominance and the general, also just in Latin, it had been called like this, as we've seen. There is, as we were saying, also the possibility of a much older Ragusan settlement, right? Because at least, in the sense at the latest, in the 5th century, and that would be supported not just archaeologically, but also for another reason that has been theorized, that is to say, considering the coastline of Dalmatia, there would be practically a hole exactly in the correspondence of Ragusa as far as the safe, say the distance of safe havens, of known safe havens historically, for cabotage, for coastal navigation in Galleys times were concerned, right? Basically, you would have to travel by ship along the coast for 45-50 nautical miles a day, and cities ports would develop exactly in the correspondence of this almost standardized distance. Naturally, that wouldn't be the only reason why such havens would develop in the first place. Was also an hinterland logic, and looking at a bit at the location of Ragusa on the sea with this sheltered bay by the rocks, the easily defensible position. It's quite likely that this place had always been inhabited, or at least from a very long time. And so what actually happened, even at the time of the other Slavs invasions, was that simply there was a pre-existing settlement, right, on the Byzantine coast that gradually became was either repopulated with some refugees or simply grew in importance throughout this time. We just don't know too much too well what really happened. And this whole would be present considering that Ragusa is exactly between the two Hellenic settlements of Budva and Korsula, which are 95 nautical miles apart. So just like double the distance normally this galleys could perform, and by stopping at some point at a port at night. So that would make the location of Dubrovnik very likely for a previous settlement. Now, however things went, because again, we don't know clearly, like early medieval times, especially from the Balkan side, the Byzantine side, are not so well documented. These were also ferocious times as far as the perturbation of the Mediterranean unity was concerned, were the centuries of the Islamic invasions of the Saracen piracy. So much so that the Muslims laid siege to Ragusa between 866 and 67. Right, the Saracens were looking essentially for mostly these fortified centers on the coast to launch raids, to have a market. They weren't really demographic colonies, but it could be quite insidious because in order to storm a port, that definitely requires lots of naval resources. Sometimes you can try coups, things like that, so every situation is different. But in any case, it requires an equal naval commitment to retake again, right? Because if this city can't be kept, it requires to be besieged from the sea in a way, from land in a way or another. So if somebody is simply resupplying the city from the sea, and you cannot prevent that from happening, it's quite difficult in general, not always. And we've made that video about the siege of Acre, for example, where the city was supplied but not adequately, and the forces from land were larger. But generally speaking, right, all these maritime republics were incredibly nasty because Ragusa would never become a major naval power. But in any case, at once, say it would be typical, right, just to be the only powers around to have a satisfactory fleet, right? At the time of the Saracen siege of 866-67, we were still in a time where the maritime republics have not quite emerged as with a distinct profile. At least we would have to take the 10th and especially the 11th century to see some real naval force on their own. At this point, the Byzantines have an important naval power. I made videos about the Byzantine Navy exactly in these centuries. And the Saracen siege was very intense, which shows how also important the Ragusa really was for strategically speaking. So much so it lasted 15 months, an unusual time, right? And it was raised only thanks to the intervention of the Byzantine fleet under the Admiral Nicetas or Rifas that had been sent by the Emperor Basil I. This was a major operation. So first of all, consider how much the Ragusans had been resisting on their own, so how many resources they had in store. But it was a big deal for the Byzantine Empire more because, in any case, their power was crushing, and just the appearance of the Byzantine fleet and the victory over the Saracens had, especially after that long siege, had left the Ragusans completely incapable of opposing a real resistance. So technically these lands belonged to the empire, always remember that. And on this occasion, the Byzantines took advantage of the situation to receive fundamentally the acknowledgement of their own suzerainty over the local Slavic tribes of the coast that, in fact, sent their envoys to the emperor. Right, Basil dispatched officials, agents, and missionaries to the region to also give, some, to show the rewards of a restored imperial rule over these coastal communities, and part also in the Hinterland, because largely the Hinterland was very primitive, right? Very tribal, very very brutal in many ways, and so we can say that most of the communities revolved really around these ports, and that's why the Hinterland wants and the ports being capable simply of dominating their economy and making them dependent on the cities. This region would be properly framed under the new imperial theme of Dalmatia, right? The Slavic tribal principalities of the Hinterland would remain, as we've seen, largely autonomous because nobody was really interested in going to dislodge them from their mountains and forests that would have caused a continuous guerrilla attrition and so on. They weren't very dangerous because the coastal cities were essentially, as we've seen, more capable. So the Byzantines used their own, simply, control the key points, and then everything will fall in its place on the long run, just by cultural osmosis, right? We will come back, hopefully soon, on the history of the Balkan hinterland in some detail, right? I made a video about the Duchy of Croatia. We have seen how the Christianization of the Slavs was begun, how there was, in fact, a competition between the Greeks and the Latins already about this. As you know, Croatia would fall essentially under Roman protection, whereas the Serbs remain stuck to the Byzantines. There was also another conflict, more or less along the same pattern, given that Venice, at this point, was growing in importance, in power. Remember that, in theory, this was also a Byzantine possession, even though it had been autonomizing herself substantially. The aggressivity, properly, of Venetian naval and market expansion is one of the most shocking things in the history of naval power. They managed really to take control an incredible amount of resources, the salt mines of Comacchio, the remaining properly well sheltered in their islands on the lagoons, developing from continental powers, but also in fact starting to wait for them too, because most of the exports also from, let's say, the trade of the Adriatic passed through in the hands of Venice, that controlled in part this flow as far as the Po River was concerned, so also towards Central Europe. And as you know, Venice had been playing a bit in between the two the two empires at that point. But it was still technically not part of Italy, not part of the Frankish kingdom, but of the empire and of Constantinople. I mean, for which naturally she remained always very in touch with the city, especially as far as the trade advantages were concerned. But at the same time, this growth in power meant also the weakening of Byzantine control on Venice. Reason for which, given that Ragusa was instead, autonomous but still more tied to Byzantine rule, especially at this time, the Venetians grew hostile to Dubrovnik. Right? They became rivals with Ragusa, and tried also to bring the city under their control. Right, it was a failed attempt to conquer Ragusa in 948, right, for which the Ragusans also devoted themselves to Saint Blaise, that figures also in the banner of the city, as he was on that occasion adopted as her patron saint, right, had prevented the Venetians from succeeding in their intent. So I'm making things very simple, but throughout these centuries of the High Middle Ages, Ragusa remained essentially within the Byzantine orbit. The main change, aside from the hostility with Venice, also the issues with the Slavic piracy, because the Dalmatian coastline is quite fascinating in this regard. There are still pagans there. There are still every bay, every peninsula, every island can be a pirate nest on its own. This would go on forever. Think about the Uskoks in modern times, etc. So there was a lot of room for sort of really infestation, right, of the rivals' territories with proxy wars and so on. However, the major change, really, with a Venice that had been expanding dramatically, naturally, in these centuries, is the Fourth Crusade. As you know, the Venetians first stormed Zara with the help of the Crusades. Then they conquered Constantinople. And the Byzantine Empire was parceled between the French and in Venice. And at this point, Ragusa really had no protection, right? There were, however, other periods of external domination. In fact, the Venetians had succeeded to control Dubrovnik between roughly 1000 and 1030 AD. The Normans, too, had some brief dominations, one from 1081 to 1085, the other from 1172, the other from 1189 and 1190. You realize the dates here are meaningful because they correspond to important expeditions also in the Byzantine hinterland, either the Crusades or wars between the Siculo-Normans and Constantinople, telling you how permeable, after all, Ragusa really was at this point. This is normal. This is the Middle Ages, right? You have a sort of... You're under somebody, one way or another. It can be an empire, some kingdom, a lordship, right? Everything is quite fluid, and it depends on the circumstances, the military outcome, right, etc. And it's difficult for the Byzantines to provide with any help, right, especially starting from the late 11th and the 12th century, when the Westerners basically are starting to take over the seas, right? The Venetians are practically the best naval power around. Then you have the Siculo-Normans that also have some significant capacity, especially against the Byzantines. And the Byzantines mostly are concerned in defending their own core lands, and so mostly navigating in the Aegean, not leaving the most important coastal regions exposed for sheltering a maritime republic that they don't even control directly, just per se. And then, not that it wasn't important, we will see now that the role of Ragusa definitely increased in importance. There were also relations with Balkan powers, right? Other ones from probably the Hinterland. In 1050, for example, the Croatian king Stephen I made a land grant along the coast that extended the boundaries of Ragusa to Zato, that is 16 kilometers north of the original city. This would provide specifically the Ragusans with the abundant supply of fresh water that emerged from a spring at the head of the Ombla Inlet. Right, these springs were really important for coastal navigation because, again, could allow the galleys to resupply much more quickly, and just kind of giving them more autonomy, right? And so more strategic projection, right? Not a huge game changer, but still, through that spring, you could consolidate an important area as far as your control, naval influence on it was concerned all around. So these were the steps of taken by the Ragusans to consolidate their political autonomy by appealing to the economic needs of the interland powers mostly. Stephen of Croatia granted on the same occasion the harbor of Gruš, which is today the commercial port of Dubrovnik, which is quite interesting in historical perspective. And again, this was done in exchange for some trade agreements. Again, the important was to diversify, especially the commercial dependency of these powers on, say, mostly Venice, and creating NATO relations that could allow the passage of certain goods without paying too much from another area, and or in fact allowing to be supplied from the Mediterranean, also in case of war, of naval blockades, etc. At least, interruption of certain commercial relations, and this was really meaningful. So at this point, the Ragusan commune comprised the city of Ragusa, then Šupa Dubrovačka, Gruš, Ombla, Zaton, and the Elafiti Islands. That would be the aforementioned Šipan, Lopud, and Koločep. Right. Also, there are many smaller islands near the city. Now, it would be boring just to list one by one. But again, they were all important, especially all together as a net of havens, of even just of spotting sites, right? They were fortified, they were garrisoned, and so in case even just of siege of one settlement, you could count on those forces to harass even autonomously the enemy. So everything was done with a very sound strategic vision. Muhammad al-Idrisi, the famous 12th century Arab geographer, mentions Ragusa and the surrounding area from his travels. He refers to the city as the southernmost one of Croatia. So he identified by that point the Croatian influence for how it had grown historically. That Croatia is, it takes the name after the Slavic people to settle. So here there is, of course, a proximity, right, a kinship. But politically wise, right, they were quite two different things, right? The Ragusans were, jealous, as we've seen, of their of their autonomy, and they wouldn't think to be they would be in agreement with other powers and also technically under them, but not part of them, right? With a boundary where you can't say Ragusa is within Croatia and just belongs to it, right? So at least al-Idrisi was observing mostly a situation, of political, connection, right? In 1191, the Byzantine Emperor Isaac II, Angelus, that was actually mostly the real lord, at least felt, the Byzantines to really still be in the place of exercising some authority on the Commune, granted, and in this sense with the expectation of tying the city definitely more to Constantinople, the Ragusan merchants the right to trade freely, in fact, in the Byzantine capital. These were stormy times for the empire. They had problems with the Latins, as you know, in a few decades. In fact, Constantinople would fall herself. So, let's say the Byzantines tried to catch within a broader net of people that could, at some point, kind of supplant temporarily the Italian merchants that they, at some point, kind of kicked out, killed, robbed, etc., but that they hopelessly needed at that point for their own, not just their own, economy, but also for their own fleet and so on. Similar privileges were obtained by Ragusa in 1186 from Serbia and in 1189 from Bosnia, that were growing a bit also in importance. They were trying to essentially emancipate themselves from the Byzantine Empire as well, also in the wake of the Third Crusade, and would, especially later, after the fourth one. We mentioned the Charter of Ban Kulin before. That is also the first official document where Ragusa is referred to as Dubrovnik. We also recalled how, after the Fourth Crusade, Ragusa falls under Venetian suzerainty. This would last essentially until the 50s of the 14th century, so a century and a half. The Venetians had invaded Dalmatia already in 1202, right? So before the end of the Fourth Crusade, and from this time on, Ragusa was forced to pay a tribute to the Serenissima. Dubrovnik began in this now Venetian sphere of influence to supply Venice herself with products that she could export from the Balkan hinterland, such as hides, wax, but also silver and other metals. Right? Venice had a quite, substantial arms and armor export business. She also periodically raided in the Slavic hinterland, even for slaves, especially as long as some areas had remained pagan and or had at least kept maintaining a piratic lifestyle. Right? They sold them to the Egyptians and things like that. Venetians used also Ragusa herself as a naval base in the southern Adriatic Sea, in a time in which they cared particularly, as always, for whenever there was a strong power with ambitions from both sides of the Adriatic, to prevent, in fact, the Strait of Otranto being closed, because that would have bottled up Venice in a lake at that point rather than a sea. But there was really nobody who could counter her at this point at sea, if not maybe the Genoese. Unlike with Zadar, there was really not much friction between Ragusa and Venice. right? Zara it would remain, but historically speaking, a great object of content, especially because it was closer to Hungarian power. So it was easier for the Magyar monarchs to just make leverage on the city to rebel against Venice. They would besiege the same Venetian Zadar at some point. And the reason why the relations between Venice and Ragusa were fundamentally okay at this point is, again, because there was not much of a match between the two powers by scale. In any case, as we will see, in the later Middle Ages, Ragusa would grow instead as more of a competitor with Venice, especially as an alternative medium in the trade between the East and the West, right? The main problem for the Ragusans naturally would be the fact that the Venetians were essentially a foreign rule. They exacted tributes from them, but they would pay. In the mid-13th century, the island of Lastovo was added to the aforementioned Ragusan coastland. Also on January the 22nd, 1325, the Serbian king Stefan Uroš III, Stefan Dešanski, issued a document for the sale of his maritime possessions. We will see that in videos about Serbian history, hopefully. All of the city of Ston, specifically in the peninsula of Peleshšac, to Ragusa. This was happening, Serbia was about to reach her peak, right? In fact, and this entailed more than else the rationalization of the of their territories that for in a short time grew quite rapidly, and they felt, especially for being supplied from the west, including from Italy, with taking an alternative route to Venice. I made a video about Balkan warfare exactly in these centuries, and we've seen the dramatic amount of Italian imports as far as arms and armor were concerned. Needed to rationalize again a continental dominion and strengthening at the same time Ragusa to be ever more competitive with Venice, right? In 1333, at the peak of Serbian power under the king Stefan Uroš IV Dušan, also the aforementioned two possessions were completely handed over to Ragusa. The Serbians had historically maintained some kind of coastline in Dalmatia, but it was kind of complicated to do anything with that, so that's in part the reason why they, from the other side of the Dinaric Alps, they decided to count on Ragusa most. In January 1348, there is also the Black Death striking Ragusa, which has given that the scourge was coming from mostly from the east, from the Mediterranean ports, was also one, in fact, of the first European cities to be hit by the contagion. And this was to shatter, as you know, a bit old medieval civilization a bit. In 1358, in fact, the Treaty of Zadar forced Venice to yield all claims to Dalmatia. This doesn't mean that they actually lost direct power here and there. But the Hungarians had obliged the Venetians with a war that had involved also the siege of Zadar and enormous resources spent even by the Venetians at some point in the previous years. 1 million ducats, right? So back down, and the Hungarians didn't have really much of a capacity to control Dalmatia themselves alternatively. In any case, Ragusa, trying to acquire more autonomy, accepted as part of this broader treaty, and the fact that up to that point she had been under Venice, and mildly so, the hegemony of King Louis I of Hungary. On May the 27th of the same year, the final agreement was reached at Visegrad in Hungary between Louis and the Ragusan Archbishop Ivan Saraca. It's in this way that Dubrovnik recognized Hungarian sovereignty, but the local nobility continued to rule practically without much interference from the Hungarian court at Buda, right? And the interesting thing is that actually there was not even a direct royal connection, because the Visegrad agreement had specified that Dubrovnik was formally under the jurisdiction of the Ban of Croatia, right? So this didn't make it that easy, because yes, the Hungarian kings tried to go past the Banal authority, and the Ban of Croatia, as just Croatia basically, that at this point had de facto lost her independence to Hungary, was still, however, acting as Croatia. Plus, the Venetians were still around, so it was not much of an easy situation, but Ragusa managed to handle herself well. There was also, again, not much of a huge attrition between all these powers, especially with Hungary. Ragusa was okay. The Venetian count that had traditionally ruled over Ragusa left as soon as the agreement was signed. So now the Maritime Republic was freer than she had been before, and more powerful than she had been before. In 1399, Ragusa acquired all the area up to Pelishats, which would be called Dubrovačko Primorje, right? So the essentially the Ragusan coastline, and this strip included Slano as well. This entire wall was known in Latin as Terre Nove, so the new lands. This land had been essentially purchased by the Ragusans from the Bosnian king, Stephen of Styria, for similar reasons to the ones we explained also for the Serbians, for the Hungarians. There was at some point a war with Bosnia that tried to capture the city in 1403 and 1404, but they couldn't really do much against her fortification. Between 1419 and 1426, the Konavle region, south of Astarea, including the ancestral city of Cavtat, was included in the Ragusan possessions. In the meanwhile, Ragusa was enjoying a moment of not just political or economic, but also cultural prosperity, where in the 15th century the Renaissance is in the air. The Cardinal Ivan Stojkovic, in the Latin sources Ioannes de Caravaggio, was active in Ragusa as a church reformer and writer. There was surely a prosperity, as we've seen, among the patriciate of the city, kind of also urbanistic expansion. This was also the peak period of trade relations between Bosnia and a bit all the surrounding regions, and the Ragusan merchants would participate in this system, and as especially the establishment of the largest caravan trade route directly between Podvysoky and Ragusa exemplifies. But Podvysoky was a medieval castle town, right, in modern-day Visoko, Bosnia and Herzegovina. This era of trade with Bosnia culminated in 1428, when we know that an agreement between a group of Vlachs and the Republic, specifically the Lord of Ragusa, Tomo Bunic, was signed, right, on August the 9th. The Vlachs promised to provide a delivery of 600 horses along with 1,500 motives of salt, right? Of course, it was something paid in exchange. But this tells also how, and this would continue during the early modern age, important really, the Republic of Ragusa was for the Balkan hinterland, really. So we like a bit as moderns to look at trade routes reaching very far away, trade, naval engineering, and all the cartography and all this stuff. But even if you look at this kind of poorer realities of the Balkan hinterland, especially in the immediate one, and there you realize that even modest, primitive economies were still quite productive, especially in quantity of goods. And it was mostly this humble traffics on a more local basis actually constituted also the wealth and the surplus and the prestige of the local oligarchies. Now, at this point, the Ottoman crescent was appearing over Europe, right? The Ottomans had been swarming in the Balkans. They had been gradually providing also with some naval forces, mostly constituted a continental threat, though, that the Republic of Ragusa had to handle in a way or another. In 1430 and 1442, there were some short-term agreements with the Ottomans, right, that would define more or less what, Ragusa at that point, that was without much of a continental protection, had to be part, like in which status would have to acquire. In 1458, so 5 years after the fall of Constantinople, Ragusa signed a treaty with, in fact, Constantinople, but now in Ottoman hands, which made the Republic a tributary to the Sultan, in fact. This entailed from the Republican side this show of display of fidelity, I'm quoting the agreement, truthfulness and submission to the Sultan, right, which entailed, as we've seen as other powers, an annual tribute to be paid by Ragusa, which in 1481 was defined specifically at 12,500 gold coins. However, the advantages of this agreement entailed an Ottoman protection, right, and especially the extension of enormous trade privileges for the Republic, right, that as a consequence also would maintain the necessary autonomy to make her trade flourish, for also the Ottoman economy to profit from this, right? As a consequence, Ragusa had not completely lost her room for maneuvering. For example, she kept allying herself with the Republic, the Maritime Republic of Ancona, in the Marches and the Adriatic Sea. That was definitely not a threat to Venice. Again, Venice, especially at this point, had been consolidating a terra firma power in northern Italy, was, an ever more, compact power. And it was not nor Ragusa nor Ancona to create really problems to her. But you understand that being backed by the Ottomans, Ragusa could still enjoy also a military protection against the Venetian arrival. in fact, also internationally speaking, the Ragusans were allowed by the Ottomans to sign treaties, as they had always been doing with international politics, as long as, of course, they served, or at least they would not conflict with Ottoman interests. Right, the Ottomans allowed the Ragusans to sail with their own under their own flag. So this was a huge deal, and the Ragusan trade rights were especially extended within all the empire. Most of the Ragusan activity entailed an Adriatic traffic, right? It was carried out on behalf of the Ottomans, right? There were for this especially tax exemptions, right, and further trade benefits from the port. As we will see now, there was also a continental route, specifically, not just a maritime one. There were Ragusan colonies operating as really a part of the Ragusan, say, republic in major Ottoman cities, and a great privilege for the Ragusans granted by Constantinople was the possibility of entering the Black Sea, which was otherwise closed to non-Ottoman shipping, and that especially the Italians had lost at that point. As you know, the Genoese especially had been maintaining significant colonies in the Black Sea, and the rise of the Ottomans ruined a bit the party for them. So again, the Ottomans never risked to see Ragusa taking the place of what had been, in fact, powers like Venice or Genoa, like in the Byzantine Empire, right? But the trade, say, stimulated income and general dynamicization, let's say, of Ottoman commerce was relevant. And the empire was huge, so but the main problem again was Venice in that regard, so that the Ottomans essentially exempted the Ragusans from more custom duties than any other foreign merchant, right, and provided the Republic with diplomatic support from the same imperial administration, especially as far as the trade disputes with the Venetians were concerned, right? So what mattered was mostly this proximity, right, the Adriatic position, and how the Ottomans could interfere in Venetian affairs through Ragusa. The Ottomans were not the only power who would try to bypass Venice in a way, in order to at least still conduct more direct trade with the East, right, beyond the Serenissima that still controlled the fact of the whole thing. That the Ottomans and the Venetians were at war many times, but most of the time they traded themselves. So there was a lot of Ottoman-Venetian de facto partnership, also, and especially in the early modern age, when they realized that the opening of the Atlantic, the Indian routes, were kind of threatening the Mediterranean trade, including this was a problem that the Ragusans suffered as well. But for example, Florence privileged Ragusa, essentially making their merchants travel from the papal ports of Pesaro, Fano, and Ancona, in fact on the Adriatic, to reach Ragusa, from which they went, essentially they reached the Bursa, right, in northwestern Anatolia. And the route was, interestingly enough, a continental one, right? Florence didn't have so much of also naval potential. Mostly they embarked cargoes, and then they proceeded. There were also the maritime routes, of course, but the step would be Bosna Sarai, that is today's Sarajevo, that had been fundamentally established by the Ottomans as at this point as the rising center in Bosnia. From there to Novi Pazar in Serbia, the etymology of which is evidently new market. Then Skopje in Macedonia, and from there Plovdiv and Adrianople. So Constantinople, Bursa, etc. As you understand, it was a Balkan route, which was quite trafficked. Consider that, now we can't digress across the thing, but again, there were lots of Venetian interferences in the inland. With the Habsburgs, they tried to trigger some kind of Serbian resistance. Think about the Idoks. There were the Croatians that were resisting. I mean, there is lots of stuff going on. We'll hopefully see this in another video, but just to give the idea of how complicated the Hinterland really was. And Ragusa would continue, in fact, during the Renaissance to have this important role, engaging in trade relations, also with Spain, for example. It was enemy with the Ottoman Empire, etc., at different times. So when you look at this center, for which you would have to go at war with the Ottomans in order to dislodge, right? You understand that the Venetians had some interesting competitors in the Ragusans, in the Adriatic, and as far as timber imports were concerned, were oak forests in the Gargano, in Apulia, in the Kingdom of Naples, that the Ragusans imported at times, again, for other policies and trade relations that now we can't quite digress on, right? There is no doubt that Ragusa would, however, gradually also decline under the Ottomans in the early modern age. This is true a bit for the general Mediterranean traffic, at least in relation to the oceanic ones, but say being within the orbits of the Ottomans is not as economically stimulating as it may seem, right? Actually, the Ottomans have a real problem because they are a great power. They have this great capital and legacy. Together with it, they centralize, they have a lot of wealth, but their society is not as economically thriving as the Western one, right? So this was evident since the Middle Ages. In the Byzantine Empire, the Ottomans inherited that, and generally speaking, Ragusa was doomed to be tied with the Ottoman fate, essentially, and eventually falling in somebody else's orbit, even on the longer run. However, this was a bit the medieval approach. There are interesting stories, again, about the city. I will surely make some other videos on Ragusa because it deserves, as you understand, and there is always new stuff also coming up with the research gradually and so on, especially as far as the mercantile models of the Republic are concerned. However, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.